Metropolitan Area. I am Dr. Irma Becerra, President of Marymount University. Marymount is one of the 17 regionally accredited colleges and universities across the National Capital Region that make up the members of the consortium. Marymount has been operating in a hybrid format since last August, but this coming fall, we're aiming to fully return to the in-person model. This is thanks to the efforts of our Marymount community members to stem the spread, as well as the efforts of our fellow consortium members and beyond to promote health and safety and research these vaccines. I am looking forward to seeing what the new academic year will bring. Through the organization, I meet regularly with fellow presidents in the area, and we all know that many members of our community have serious and reasonable questions and concerns about the COVID vaccines. It is also clear that misinformation, both unintentional and purposeful, is proliferating, especially through social media. In response, we are hosting these panels in hopes of providing you with a direct access to unbiased experts from across the consortium institutions, and I'm grateful to be joined by these esteemed colleagues who include Dr. Lynn Goldman. She is the Michael and Lori Milken Dean and Professor of Environmental and Occupational Health at the Milken Institute School of Public Health at George Washington University. Dr. Goldman was formerly the Assistant Administrator for Toxic Substances at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and previously Professor of Environmental Health Sciences at Johns Hopkins University's Bloomberg School of Public Health, where she received her master's in public health. She also received her Master's of Science from UC Berkeley and her medical degree from the University of California, San Francisco. Welcome, Dr. Goldman. Also joining us today, Dr. Hugh is the Dean of Howard University's College of Medicine and also Vice President for Clinical Affairs and Professor of Obstetrics. He was formerly the Vice Chancellor for Clinical Affairs at Louisiana State University's Health Sciences Center. He has an MBA from Loyola University in Baltimore and received his medical degree from the University of Maryland, where he served as chairman of the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology. Welcome, Dr. Mighty. Dr. Carrie O'Reilly is the Director of Clinical Simulation and Laboratory Operations and Assistant Professor of Nursing at Trinity Washington University. She received her BSN at Oral Roberts University, her MSN from the University of Phoenix, and her Ph.D. in Health Sciences from Touro University International. Welcome, Dr. O'Reilly. And Dr. Stephen Thomas is the principal investigator with Dr. Sandra Quinn on the Center of Excellence in Race, Ethnicity, and Health Disparities Research, funded by the National Institute for Minority Health and Health Disparities. One of the nation's leading scholars in the effort to eliminate racial and ethnic health disparities, Dr. Thomas received his master's in health education from Illinois State University and his doctorate in community health education from Southern Illinois University. And welcome, Dr. Thomas. Thank you all so much for agreeing to be part of this critical discussion. Our questions today were solicited from our community, and we also have staff monitoring the chat function, so please feel free to submit additional questions anytime. We are using the chat function for technical support, but we're asking you that you submit your questions through the Q&A function in Zoom, which is what our participants will be seeing. And we will be answering your questions throughout this panel. So first I wanna pose one question and I'll ask our panelists to answer from their perspectives, and would like to see at least two perspectives on each of the following questions. So first question is as follows. How do we know the vaccine works? What does it mean that some people are still getting the virus after receiving the vaccine? Dr. Goldman.
So primarily how we know that it works is because of the randomized clinical trials that were done before they received authorization from the Food and Drug Administration. And so how that works is they had tens of thousands of people who were at random, either given the vaccine or not, and then were followed to see if they became infected. And in fact, we see that nearly all of them who had received the vaccine had no infections, whereas there were normal rate of infections among those who had not been vaccinated. And then, then FDA did authorize them, and I apologize for the yapping dog. I think she's agreeing with me. But after that, we've been able to follow up, and the healthcare workers who received the first rounds of vaccines also have very rarely gotten the disease. So we know it's actually working in a larger population. And then, but the last piece of it is there's a difference between receiving the vaccine and being immune. In the first place, it takes a couple of weeks after you receive all the vaccination before you're fully immune. So if you catch the virus right after getting the vaccine, you're not immune yet. But also, they're not perfect. And think about if they're 95% effective, that means 5% don't get immunity. That means 1 out of every 20 people receiving the vaccine don't get it. So each of us individually isn't protected, even when the population is protected. And that's what we mean by herd immunity. The group is protected, but it doesn't mean each and every one of us is protected. And so there's still a chance of spread, and why we're being careful with masks and distancing and everything, even as we're vaccinating.
Excellent. So if anyone else would like to add to why is it that go ahead, Dr. O'Reilly, please.
I also think there's an important piece here about education, about the purpose and function of vaccines. Although we do want to provide protection against a disease, the goal is to allow the best possible outcome when exposed to the disease. And some of that can mean that we don't want a severe reaction that requires hospitalization, ventilation for respiratory support, or death in the case of COVID-19. And the one thing that we have found with all of the vaccines that are currently approved is that there is a nearly 100% success rate in the elimination of severe reaction to COVID should it be received after they're vaccinated. These patients who have been vaccinated do not have severe disease, are not admitted to the hospital, are not in ICU and on a ventilator, and do not die from the disease. So if these vaccines are actually producing that kind of outcome, I think that we've been successful for that person. And it also significantly limits the ability of that person to pass the disease on to another individual. We're still calculating what those kind of statistical numbers look like, but we know that the odds of you becoming a vector for somebody else is significantly limited if you've been vaccinated. So if we're educating people correctly, the goal is for you to not never have the disease, but to limit your exposure, to limit the odds of you having severe disease and from dying from the disease and passing it on. All of those things provide significant support to the community. And I think if people understand that, their willingness to be vaccinated would increase.
Thank you, Dr. O'Reilly. How dangerous are the side effects, and how likely am I to have side effects from the vaccine? And also, how can we know about long-term side effects if these vaccines are so new? Dr. Mike.
In our experience, having administered several thousand vaccines now, we've seen side effects, to be sure. Very rarely do we see a significant enough side effect, such as a near anaphylactic reaction that requires us to send somebody to the emergency room, for example. So it's very rare to see it. And so I would say that they're very safe. The current pause, as you know, as everyone is aware of now, is on the Johnson & Johnson vaccine because of potential issues with clotting. I think it's just as important as we educate folks to balance the scales, right? To understand that if there's a side effect, that side effect is first noted, which the CDC did. We take an action to make sure that we investigate it, but also to frame it in a way. For example, the current venous thrombus issue that we're looking at occurs naturally in about 5 per million people. There have been 7 million Johnson & Johnson vaccines given to develop 5 to 6 cases. So we know that, again, relatively speaking, we don't have years and years of experience with the vaccines, with none of them. So to say there's not going to be any side effects is way too soon to say that. And each of them has had their moments. So what we need to continually do is to educate and then balance what we see in terms of receiving the vaccine versus not receiving the vaccine versus the risk of severe side effects. So the risk of severe side effects are very low. Those who get the vaccine are protected very well versus those who do not get the vaccine. So I think that it's still, the risk to benefit is still very heavily in favor of getting a vaccine.
Thank you, Dr. Mighty.
So Madam President, I'm standing here with the barber pole.
Yes.
Because the work I do is to translate a lot of what you've just heard from our clinical scholars into language that the brothers and the sisters at the community level can understand, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And so when it comes to people who are questioning, should they take the vaccine or fearful of the vaccine side effects, one of my barbers taught me this. He says, if you choose not to take the vaccine because it's your choice, you have to know there's language out there. It's your liberty. It's your choice. Okay. You don't have a choice of what version of severity of the COVID infection you'll get. You don't know if you're going to get the asymptomatic. You're infected, but you have no symptoms. In fact, that's the major way in which the virus is spread. You don't know if you're going to get the I'm home for 2 weeks or hospitalized for 3 weeks or put on a ventilator or potentially die. Those are all things you have no control over if you do not take the vaccine and you get infected. If you take the vaccine, we know this, that side effects, if any, will occur within a relatively short period of time after the injection, and that the companies are required to follow participants over time. We've just had the first 6-month report, and those reports came out very good for the vaccine's effectiveness. And they're required to also monitor all participants over time. So as it was just mentioned, think about it, 7,000 people who received, we're just talking about this one J&J vaccine, and out of that 7 million.
Yeah.
7 million. Out of that 7 million, they identified 6. No, those are 6 tragic results. But that you have a system that sensitive that could pick up 6 adverse cases in 7 million says the system's working. And that's what the assurance we want to give to the community. We have checks and balances to minimize risk and ensure that things are safe. Yes, when you read that headline about contamination at a plant in Baltimore, guess what? None of that vaccine left the plant. Checks and balances worked. We can have confidence in the FDA. And just because you get vaccinated doesn't mean you throw away your mask. In parts of the country, people are, the vaccine is like a fireproof suit. When the fireman runs into that burning house, he's got 95% protection. But you wouldn't want to run into the burning house willy-nilly. So even after you're vaccinated, you don't want to take risks because there's still a chance. You have protection, but it's not perfect. And so I think we need analogies that help the common folk understand what we're talking about in a language that they get. And then the last thing I'll say is my barber says to someone who's hesitant, you smoke, you're overweight, and you don't exercise. That's greater risk. So So you got to give them comparisons of risk and benefits. Thank you.
Well said, Dr. Thomas. I think we touched a little bit on the Johnson & Johnson. I would like each of you to share your views on the recent advisory about Johnson & Johnson vaccine and what that means for members of our community that are considering vaccination.
So I could start on that. I actually was able to sit in and, on the meeting that they had at the CDC yesterday, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. And I have to say, I'm very impressed with how rapid they've been. I think that Stephen mentioned that's been very, very rapid. And Hugh, that they have not waited around, to see if there are adverse effects. I've also been very impressed with how thorough they are. And I think that the pause that they've taken is one that shows an excess of precaution, but I think that's appropriate given the seriousness of the effect and the need to make sure that we're really counting all of the cases and that we see the full spectrum of the effect. I think it's a good thing. It'll probably be another week before they come back, but I am heartened by the fact that it is a very rare effect. While at the same time being, of course, concerned about how severe it is, and also that it's a kind of a unique thing. There's something about it that medically is something we're not used to recognizing, and that makes me want to see them dig into it more deeply, like they're doing, to make sure that some more common things aren't kind of floating along with that. I have to tell you that I've been involved for many years with the FDA. And this reporting system that they have to detect the adverse effects, I've been on advisory committees that say it's got to work faster, it's got to be more efficient. They've done that. I'm so impressed with how quickly they were able to get those reports. And I'm thankful to them for having the courage to say, we're just going to put a pause while we figure this out. I think we have a lot of reason to be confident in both the FDA and the CDC today.
That's wonderful.
Now, Madam President, I want to be mindful, and I think we should all be mindful that coming through 4 years of it's a hoax, 4 years of, it's going to go away by itself, 4 years of it's just like the flu, you don't overcome that in a few months. Yeah. And so I think there's a reason why there was this error on the side of a precaution, because these kind of things happen all the time in clinical trials. But they never make the front page news. They would never be in the front page news like this. So this is the abundance of caution. The other is that this particular situation with the clots, a funny thing, and I'll let my clinicians clarify that you would typically may treat that with a blood thinner of some type. But in this particular case, that would be the wrong approach. And so they have to get the message to the clinicians. Because the one-shot J&J was being used heavily in primary care practices because it was easier, and they have to make sure that the clinical community knows that you don't treat it with what you might think would be typical. This is unusual, so they have to get that information out. And many of my clinical partners said they learned about it from Wolf Blitzer, so they were a bit surprised. So that's how fast it came out. Dr. Goldman, it came out so fast that everybody was learning about it from Wolf Blitzer rather than getting an email, a phone call, or a text to let you know that there were issues coming. So there's still some communication challenges. As you can imagine, you would rather not hear it from Wolf Blitzer if you were just giving people the vaccine in your office. So we have to be patient and tolerant with one another. And I think that, again, there is some confidence that the current administration is in charge, is managing this, and is being transparent. We're now behind the curtain and watching how it's all made, and that's really unusual. So we'll give all of us some tolerance to absorb all of what we're learning. It's very complicated.
I just second that because, again, this is the most public display medicine in motion that's ever been out there. We're all part of a very, very large, almost global clinical trial. And it has so much attention that the communication piece sometimes is challenging, right? The need to get the word out quickly sometimes gets behind the messaging and how to frame that. So I think we responded to the J&J event just as they responded to the AstraZeneca event. It was very quick. The word did get out. We shut everything down in terms of pivoting away, waiting for the pause to be, investigated. But I'd also say that we still have 2 other vaccines in play, and they're readily available, and we should continue to use them until we figure out what's next.
And soon there will be others. And I know Novavax is on pace, and so that may come online as well. The real tragedy, hopefully we'll get through this, is that the J&J one shot AstraZeneca, those were the ones that were going to immunize the world, because they didn't have to have the cold storage, because they could be sent to remote areas, because it was one shot. That was our hope, because if we don't immunize the world, none of us are safe.
Yeah.
I think the only other thing that I would want to mention in terms of communication is the importance of that one-on-one provider-client discussion. When I'm sitting at a table vaccinating somebody I've never met before, one of the things that always strikes me is how much trust they place in my ability to deliver that vaccine to them safely. They have no concept of my credentials or my 43 years of experience. They just know that this vaccine is helpful to them. And that conversation is everything to support their decision to be vaccinated. And one of the things that I've noticed as I've had those conversations is how very valuable that is to that individual. What it means for them to make the decision to come back to get the second dose of a vaccination should 2 be required, or their willingness to listen carefully to the instructions I give them about the signs and symptoms that they should consider normal and those that they need to report to a primary care provider later. And that conversation cannot be underestimated. As Stephen has mentioned, we have to talk to them at a place where they can receive the information and in a way that is relevant to their life story. And part of what healthcare providers do is we learn how to do that. We learn how to build that degree of trust rather rapidly. And we need to help our primary care providers out there to know what to say, how to say it, how to communicate. So communication in the academic arena and clinically with those individuals, I think, is almost more vital at this point when there's questions about the safety of a vaccine than to individuals who are making that decision for a single vaccine. I think we need to help them to be able to have those conversations exactly as Stephen has discussed, that meets them at their point of need and helps them to build confidence in the information that they're learning. The one thing we've discovered is disinformation is so prevalent and has inculcated almost every attempt for us to try to set the record straight. And so we have Dr. Fauci and all of the leading experts at the CDC out in the media frequently, trying to say the same thing. Please have trust. But the person I'm going to trust is the physician that's been my physician for 15 years that talked me through, the last time I had a severe health condition and helped me get through it. So I'm going to trust him. I'm not going to trust somebody that I've never met before that's just a big name on a screen. And I value the fact that they will look to me because they'll see that I'm sitting there giving them a vaccine as a volunteer, not because there's anything in it for me, but that my desire is to help them to get to their point of outcome, the outcome that they want, which is to be safe. And I think we need to start by saying that those conversations are so more important than I think we give them credit for. I just want us to be able to believe that when we're communicating with them, we're doing, I think, 90% of the vaccination piece. The vaccine is really very scientifically important, but getting that person to believe that this is the right thing so that they share that with their community, even more valuable.
Excellent. Well, the following questions were submitted by students from the Consortium Universities. So I will pose a question, and if if we can have one of you answer. We have some also questions that are coming through our Q&A. So again, reminding the audience that if they want to submit their questions, please submit them through the Q&A function in your Zoom. First question, the vaccine was created so quickly. Have they really tested it? Do they really know it's safe?
I mean, I would just say yes and yes. They've tested it, and it has the same safety profile as other vaccines. The thing that a lot of people focus on, they are approved through a process called an emergency use authorization, which allowed the shortcutting of the 6 months of use before you have the final approval. And so now these companies, once they've been in use for 6 months, can go back to the FDA and change from an authorization to an approval. And we do see the wisdom of the 6 months as what we're seeing with the J&J vaccine, that once the vaccine is going to millions and millions of people, then you can see things that happen that you can't see when you're only looking at, 30, 40,000 people in a clinical trial. But these were very large trials, and this vaccine is as safe and as effective as any vaccine that's ever been approved. All three of them, even though again, they were approved via emergency use because of the pandemic, obviously. I mean, the one thing I never thought I'd see in my life is how quickly the people at the FDA moved to evaluate all of the submissions from these vaccine manufacturers. It was extraordinary effort on their part, and work that they normally spread out over many days. They worked very hard over just a few days to do it. And I think it's admirable what they were able to accomplish.
Dr. Goldman, I'm sure that was accomplished through a lot of people power, right? People working through long days, Saturdays, Sundays to make that happen. A lot of sacrifice to get us to the success where we are.
Well, when the history is written, we'll look at the development of the two first vaccines out the door as like a Manhattan Project success.
Yeah,
we could really, it's remarkable. New platform and the streamlining of the kind of administrative process, but the science was done exactly as it's always done. You can have confidence there. Mm-hmm. And that's what makes the delivery, the contrast so stark. The development of the vaccine and Manhattan style speed is our bioscience, our biomedical sciences at work, our STEM at work. But the delivery of the vaccine into the arms of people, that's the public health infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And we witnessed that public health infrastructure riddled with holes from decades of deferred maintenance. And I think that's, for the young people out there, that's what you should also look at. How we can be so great on the science side, how we could put a rover on Mars, how we could develop these two vaccines in record time, and yet have challenges in getting it into the arms of our most vulnerable citizens. That's where work moving forward should be placed, and that's the opportunity and the challenge for the next generation to ensure that we leave no one behind. We leave no one behind.
Right. The second question from our students is as follows. I am Black. How do I know they're giving me a real vaccine, and why should I trust the government?
So again, it's not a matter of, I'd say, trust the government. I would trust the government. I think you have to trust the scientists. A lot of people got behind this. In fact, one of the major developers of the vaccine that first rolled out happens to be a Black female. So it's not just the government. There are a lot of people behind this movement to make this happen. That's one. Two, I would say you can trust it because many of us who are given this vaccine have gotten vaccinated ourselves. And we were first online to get out there and, stand behind what we believe. If we're going to tell you to take it, then we ourselves should be willing to do the same. And I think we've done that. And then last but not least, millions and millions of Black people have now taken the vaccine, and they've done well with it, and they're still continuing to do well with it. So It's not trust in the unknown, as Dr. Raleigh would say, it's trust in the people around you, trust in your friends, trust in your neighbors, trust in your family.
So let me give you the message from the barbershop. And it goes a little bit like this. Why are all these white people running into the black community to get in line? If it was bad, they wouldn't be coming into your community to get in line. So that's the first thing that happens. The second thing underneath that question is do we really matter? And I think, again, some of the messaging around the single shot doses, when they were talked about being really effective for the homeless and the mentally ill, and they went down this, and I understood what they were saying. But again, right from the barbershop chair, people say, oh, that's the one they're going to send to the minority community. This sense that somehow we don't matter or don't count, because the backdrop of all this is happening with the racial reckoning and unrest in the country, what we're seeing in Minneapolis. You can't just put that, well, that's a criminal justice bucket. It has nothing to do with health and science. Yes, it does. It has everything to do with health and science, which is why we need influencers. Like Dr. Riley said, the relationship with the healthcare professionals, but some people don't have that relationship. In minority communities, the other influencers are the clergy. Remember back in the AIDS days, we realized that the Black church was so important to get the message out, to build trust. And back in the AIDS days, the AIDS ribbon, this church window, the iconography, we don't have that yet. We don't have the equivalent of the AIDS quilt. We don't have any of those things that I think is maybe just too early. But I do know that COVID has made the barbershop and salon another place where there are influencers, where attitudes are shaped, where conspiracy theories can grow, or where evidence-based information can be delivered. And that's why we have planted our flag here, so that we can get people signed up, get them vaccinated, and then bring their voices to places just like this. So I would be remiss if I didn't say they're frustrated when they can't get callbacks. They're frustrated when the internet doesn't work. And they're frustrated when they see people who know how to use those systems come into their neighborhoods and get in line first. We'll get through this, but we need to keep open conversation, not messaging, open conversation, not shaming, not blaming, because everybody's on their journey. And then making sure that when they're ready, they have easy access to this vital service.
The third question is as follows. I am opposed to abortion, and I'm concerned about the use of fetal materials in vaccine development, testing, and production. Was fetal tissue used for any of the COVID-19 vaccines?
That answer is no. So, yeah.
And yet that issue, why does it keep coming up? We know the answer is no. It comes up. Social media has pushed this. The whole anti-vax community has pushed this. But I would ask a person who asked the question simply to check with the National Conference of Bishops, the Catholic Church, many of the religious organizations, national conferences have come out and commented on this for their members, including the Muslim community. So those are the leaders in the faith communities. I think they're giving the right message that those who are concerned about this issue need not be concerned.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas.
I think it's worthwhile, Dr. Thomas, in that light, to mention some of the other misconceptions that people are repeating over and over again that are just not true. The vaccine does not cause miscarriages. It does not cause birth defects. It does not cause cancer. These are things that I hear again and again. And I think that it's because it's a new technology that people know, involves advanced genetics, that it causes people to be worried about those kinds of things. But I think other people take advantage of that by trying to create fear. And that's just not warranted. And so I think it's just important to say that those are not effects of these vaccines, as far as we know, and that there's no biological reason, there's no reason that I, as a scientist, would see to be worried about that at this point.
And Dr. Goldman, even with that, you can appreciate the question. I call it the question from the barbershop, who says, well, this mRNA vaccine, will it change my DNA? Okay, now again, some of my scientists might look and say, oh, that's a silly question. But you know what? It's not a silly question. If we take it seriously, we then can explain what the mRNA vaccine is, how it doesn't really even stay in your body. It decomposes and leaves. But now we're educating the community about genetics and how things work. We have not done a good job in doing that. If anything, we now know that science education, all this should be part of our K through 12, because this is the beginning, my friends. This is a beginning, not an end. We're going to see more, and it's not going to be 100 years before we see the next one.
I'll make it worse. And this is the problem, with, but they're actually virus infections, like the virus that causes mono, the Epstein-Barr virus, that does change your DNA. And we're not aware of that. We just think, we have a fever, we have symptoms. I don't think that's been explained to people, that certain viruses can actually transform your DNA. And I don't think that we know that COVID does that. It's because it's an RNA virus, it probably does not. However, in many ways, an actual viral infection is so much more dangerous than getting a vaccine. And that's, I think, the important message.
That's interesting, Dr. Goldman. I myself didn't know that a virus could change your DNA. So thanks for sharing that. The next question, I'm young and it seems like COVID isn't that dangerous to me. Why should I be vaccinated? Dr. O'Reilly.
So here is where I want us to focus on our current audience. This is an academic community. And although we have students and faculty, leadership in academia, one of the things I want to exhort every student here is that the purpose of your academic experience is to learn to review evidence to help you solve problems and make decisions. You're learning critical thinking skills that will help you in ways that can solve problems, not just this one, dealing with COVID. Why should I get a vaccine? How do you answer that question for yourself? Where do you find the evidence? And I want to encourage you to do more than a simple Google search. I want to encourage you to learn to use the tools at the university in which you are enrolled to help you to delve into the available knowledge that's out there that can help inform you to make that decision. What are the strategies in helping to keep a community healthy? How does that happen? And what are the past experiences that we've had with diseases that really threatened that? Very often in the media, we've heard the commonalities between what's happening with COVID and the Spanish flu that happened early in the 20th century. We've also heard about polio and the vaccinations that were developed for polio and how that changed outcomes for millions of people, how we've eradicated diseases in some places in the world, such as measles, only to have vaccine hesitancy cause those diseases to raise their heads again. So there's lots and lots of information out there for you to find and to read and to help educate yourself, to ask yourself, how do I become a part of the solution to this problem for my community, rather than continue to listen to the disinformation that social media so often offers you. What is that voice? One of the frustrating things that I hear over and over again from both students and colleagues is this concept that they say. And I always want to ask them, who are they? And who made them the expert? Where is the expert voice about this particular topic? Where do you find that information? And how do you then, how do you consume that information, and how do you help that? Use that information to help you make those decisions in your life, to problem solve for yourself. It's great to hear all of these voices that tell you that there is a truth out there, but I also think that it's important for you to find that truth for yourself and to learn to trust evidence when it's truly authoritative, and to find out who they are, and to decide whether that's the voice you really need to be listening to or not. And I think that as you do that, as you confront that in your educational journey, you'll also be able to solve much more complex life issues as you move throughout the rest of your life.
Thank you, Dr.
If I could, there are two practical things I think we should talk about in this phase.
Yes.
One is, while early on it was true that there was a lower infection rate in the younger population, that is no longer the case. So we know the infection rate in the younger population is increasing. And so that gets me to the second point, which is this vaccine is a living thing. It is going to adapt to survive, like all other living things. It adapts through its variants. Those variants come because we pass it, even if you're not infected and affected visibly, you can pass the virus back and forth. And then those viruses get together, have their own party, and form a new virus. That new virus can, in some ways, render the vaccination program of that, getting it to others less effective. So there's a very important reason to not only get yourself vaccinated, but also there's an important reason to try to protect those around you, who are your friends, your family, your community, through this process.
And because the young people truly are invincible, I'm so old, but I can still remember when I was invincible. So I love the question. And I would simply say to the young scholar out there, do you drive? And if the answer is yes, do you put your seatbelt on? And it's highly likely the person will say yes. So I'll say, well, why do you put your seatbelt on? Well, maybe at this point it's because it's the law. But I'm looking at these Hollywood squares here. We all remember when it wasn't the law, right? We had to be convinced. So I would simply say this to the young scholar. This is the first time, Dr. Fauci said, in the history of virus infection, there's never been one driven by asymptomatic people with no symptoms until now. This is why this is so scary. You can walk around and have zero symptoms and be passing this virus. So I would ask this person, do you have anybody you love? You have a grandmother? You have a family member? You have a friend or a cousin who might be a cancer survivor? It's not just about you. It's about the people you love. And if you think of it that way, I think that you understand why it's important that, yes, the young and healthy, all of us, need to be immunized against this virus.
Excellent, Dr. Thomas. Well, our audience is sending in questions, so I'm going to try to run through these because we have a number of interesting questions waiting for your expertise. So the first one, hi, Dr. Becerra. I have one question. A person who have respiratory problems like myself will be taking the COVID vaccine on Monday. Will you be more likely to experience some side effects, such as breathing issues or tiredness? And from the same person also, do these symptoms go away eventually?
So there's no simple answer whether or not you will have some of the immediate effects. The immediate effects have to do with the reaction to the vaccine that you can have both at the site of the injection in your arm and in your body, and those reactions don't occur for everybody. You don't have to have them in order to have an immune effect. Some people think if you didn't get that means you're not really vaccinated. That's not true. But they don't last very long. It's uncomfortable. I personally, with my second vaccine, had some, something that felt like chills and aches for about maybe 10 hours. I would say a lot less than what you'd experience actually just having the flu. But, it was definitely something that woke me up and made me aware, yes, I'm having a reaction. And, but it's so variable that I will say it's pretty minimal and it's pretty easy to treat with a little bit of, local care to the site, a little bit of warmth there, and a little bit of ibuprofen. I felt fine the next day.
Excellent. Another question. Excellent information, clearly explained. What do you think about antibody tests for vaccinated people who have autoimmune or other conditions that may lessen the vaccine's effect?
Again, to echo Dr. Goldman's perspective on this, it's you may not have a large show of immunity. It's going to be very variable from person to person. So it's if you don't see a big rise or a big antibody response by the blood test, it doesn't mean you didn't respond. It doesn't mean you're not protected. So it's somewhat of a challenging question to answer. But on the other hand, if you do have an autoimmune problem, then again, the issue of the vaccine is to indeed give you some protection against the virus. But measuring your blood and then saying, oh, you're not protected because you don't have some level, because the question then rises, what's the minimal level, if any, that we should have? And we simply don't know that, nor because you may not have a level does not mean you're not protected.
And I'm going to add to that. I mean, you could have a level that has to do with the general antibodies, which is what we usually measure, but these vaccines are only for very specific antibodies, and it's hard to measure those. Most clinics don't have that. But some of the immunity, a lot of it comes from your cells, not the antibodies. The cells having been exposed, knowing to attack the virus. And that is far more difficult to measure. And so we're really not doing that right now medically for individuals, measuring their individual immunity. And then, as I said before, 1 in 20 of us, even with the best of outcomes, is not going to develop immunity because of the vaccines. And the whole point isn't that each and every person has immunity. It is that, if there are 20 people in the room and at least, between 15 and 19 of them are immune, that's really good. And we won't see spread. And that's what's important. We don't want to be spreading this virus to people who are going to be harmed by it.
That's right. Another question, who is paying for the vaccines? Is the USA going to help poor countries? And if so, will this increase our income taxes?
Well, it's interesting. That's a good question. So right now, the vaccine is of no cost. When you go, they're not going to ask you for a fee, even if you go to a CVS or some of the other places. But you should know that there are costs on these vaccines. So we have paid for them. We, the American people, have paid for them, and in the other countries, these countries have paid for them. And when it comes to the developing nations around the world, an international consortium has formed, and it's called COVAX. And you should know, I think it's important that we're also transparent about the role that our country plays in the world. The previous administration pulled us out of COVAX, pulled the United States out of the international effort to ensure that the global community was vaccinated. The current administration, the Biden-Harris administration, brought us back into COVAX because you know what? Even if it's just enlightened self-interest, as Dr. Mighty just said, if we neglect a little village in the Congo, I just picked that for the example because they have no vaccine. They just talked about this in the news yesterday. If we pick a little village and allow this virus to grow, evolve, mutate, it can come back to us in a form that none of our vaccines work, and we would be back to square one. So it is in our global self-interest to vaccinate and ensure that everyone has access.
Yeah, Dr. Thomas, and I think that you've touched on something very important because it was also global collaboration that helped us achieve the vaccines to begin with, in the record speed that it was achieved. So I think it's important to highlight also that the global collaborations, and I don't know if any of you want to touch on that, how important has been for the discovery of the vaccine. Anybody wants to share a little bit about that?
Let me just say one thing, and then I'm curious how my clinicians respond. The fact that, think about it, the fact that we had the genome of this virus out of Wuhan, the Chinese published the genome. That's what allowed the mRNA vaccine to ramp up. They had the blueprint. That was miraculous. So now we look back to the original effort to decode the genome, we're building on the previous work of previous science. We're advancing science. And I think that's so very important to recognize during this period that we're in.
Exactly. I was wondering, we have a couple of minutes left, if any of you would like to have any parting thoughts to share with our audience on this important topic.
Let me just give a parting comment from the barbershop. Our language matters. The community is saying, you said that the risk was these underlying conditions. And so these are communities that have diabetes, heart disease, cancers. They're feeling that if we rush in, give the jab, and leave, that we really don't care about them. I think that we have to look at this as an opportunity for long-term engagement with these communities. And then the last thing is that we say herd immunity, and again, the barbers and say, hey, we're not cattle, Dr. Thomas. Why are they saying herd immunity? I try to explain it to them, and they say, well, that sounds like community immunity. And I said, you know what? That should be our bumper sticker. So I think that when our language causes barriers, we should be willing to re-examine. So community immunity, if that works to get the message out, then hey, young scholars out there, you social media savvy people, help us make community immunity go viral. That's the last word from the barbershops.
Thanks.
I would add to that one thing. I think that these kinds of forums are very important, and we should continue to do them. I think the more questions that are asked and the more times we get to answer them and make them understandable, the better off we're all going to be, right? Because then people can make choices not out of fear, right? Not out of being, as you said, shaman, but because they really want to undertake this and get something done, or, but they'll have choice. Take it or don't take it, but do it because you've been informed.
Excellent.
I think the final word, I guess, from the volunteer vaccinator is that what we do for every single individual on the planet only helps every other individual on the planet. Mm-hmm. The idea that somehow what we do in the developing world doesn't really matter for the people who live here in the US is incorrect. For every single person that we reach, we make an impact in that small world. And Mother Teresa says that everything that she ever did was nothing more than a small drop in the ocean, but the ocean would be much less if it hadn't received that one drop. Mm-hmm. Everything we do, every person we touch, every vaccine that gets into an arm anywhere in the world can only benefit all of us. And I think that's kind of our question. Are we global citizens? And do we really want the whole world to benefit? And I think the answer, if you would ask most people, is yes.
Yes. Dr. Goldman, you're muted. Yeah.
I would add another point as well. And because the question had to do with cost, and we are a very wealthy nation. Our wealth per capita outstrips any other. And our wealth is not just about money. Our wealth is also about the science and public health resources that we have. The fact that we were able to apply that to the creation of these vaccines, which are nearly miraculous. If you had told me, 10 years ago, we would have a global pandemic and in under a year, we'd have several effective vaccines, I would have thought you were smoking something, honestly. And so, this wealth of science and public health that we have created should be shared with the world. A lot of it we were able to generate really because of the way that we have been so prominent in the world's economy. Much of our wealth was not generated by us. Much of our wealth has come about because of our relationship with others in the world. And if we don't see ourselves as part of a broader world system, the virus does. The virus doesn't care about geographic boundaries. It doesn't care which government is in charge, who's the president, it's going to go where people are. And I think that, we need to not only, out of love and kindness and out of moral decency, share this, but also recognize that in many senses, we owe a debt to others across the world for what we've been able to achieve, which certainly we can take credit for, but so much of it has been with the contribution of many, many others across the planet that, that I think we haven't really recognized in the way that we should. So we're lucky to be here. We're lucky, but we also can't take that for granted. If we fail to control this virus worldwide, it is just going to come back and get us another way because of its ability to change and mutate over time. I think Dr. Mighty explained that pretty well. But thank you so much for hosting this. It's just a delight to get to know my colleagues from the other universities as well. It's just great people here in this community.
Thank you, Dr. Goldman, and thank you to each of you, Dr. Thomas, Dr. Mighty, Dr. Riley, Dr. Flagel, for organizing this phenomenal panel. Thank you for your insight and your expertise. Thanks to all my colleagues across the consortium for the outstanding work that you're doing every day, and especially in these unprecedented times. I am especially grateful for all of you directly involved in providing vaccines, and for our students for the incredible job that you have done this year. We are going to be graduating another group of new frontline workers that will go from the commencement stage to continue to help us recover from this pandemic in every way, not only in our hospitals with the elderly, but also in our business to help rebound this economy. And we depend on our great students that are about to graduate for the great work that they will be helping us in putting our economy together. So this has been an incredible year. All our students helped us to successfully get them to graduation. So I'm really so proud of all of them. I want to also quickly announce that the next panel will be hosted by President Cordano of Calumet University on Monday, April 19th. So don't forget to tune in. This video recording will be posted in the consortium website. And thanks again to our audience. A big round of applause to our experts. And I hope that you get your vaccine soon. I already got my second vaccine last week, so I'm very excited and ready to conquer this virus. So thank you again.
Be safe out there. Wear your mask, sanitize, and stay away from crowds. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye now.
Thank you.